Did you know that the world was 90 miles from a nuclear holocaust during the Cold War? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, espionage discovered that the Russians had nuclear missiles just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, by far the closest the world had been to experiencing nuclear war.
There are many major factors that caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1947, President Truman created the CIA, which stands for the Central Intelligence Agency, in order to gather information to maintain national security. The agency employed an unknown number of spies during the Cold War that would carry out secret operations against enemies, mainly the Soviet Union.
Planes called U-2 spy planes also became a useful means of gathering information during the Cold War. These planes became extremely useful in events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they allowed for the gathering of information without putting an agent in extreme danger. The photo to the right was taken from a U-2 plane and is extremely important because it exposed Russia's military buildup in Cuba to the U.S.
Now that we know a little bit about espionage prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, let's introduce it. The crisis was perhaps the height of the Cold War. This tense 13-day political and military standoff in October of 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba, less than 100 miles from U.S. shores, scared many Americans all over the country, politicians and citizens alike.
The Soviet Union's motives to build missile silos in Cuba were first, the Cubans recently had a revolution where the country became a one-party socialist state, which made the Soviets take an interest in them and help preserve their socialist government. Also, the Soviets couldn't match the United States' nuclear capabilities at the time. By placing warheads in Cuba, they could easily increase the number of warheads that could strike the U.S. mainland.
The summer of 1962 was when mass military buildup in Cuba occurred. The Soviet Union sent a large number of ships, which were then photographed by U.S. aerial surveillance riding high in the water, which indicates they were carrying military cargo. U-2 spy planes overflew Cuba bi-monthly and discovered SAM, or surface-to-air missile sites, but that wasn't considered a major threat. Only until after fighter jets were sighted in Cuba, the CIA began to become suspicious of the activity, however.
The CIA was originally unaware of Operation Onondir, which was the codename used for this mass military buildup operation targeting the U.S. And the U-2 missions were a major part of the U.S.'s intelligence gathering at the time, especially in Cuba. They allowed the U.S. to gather intelligence that revealed the Russians' missiles in Cuba, which significantly altered the U.S.'s relationship with Russia.
The CIA continued semi-monthly flights over Cuba throughout that summer. During that time, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Russia by a SAM, but Eisenhower, who was president at the time, denied involvement and canceled future overflights. After missile sites were discovered, the U-2 overflights were paused over the fear of an international incident, and offshore flights to photograph at an angle continued.
On October 12th, the Air Force gained the responsibility of flying the missions as it was believed that a cover story would be easier to create if the Air Force were the ones responsible. So for the first time in months, Air Force Major Richard Heiser flew over the island and recorded video evidence of nuke sites housing missiles capable of striking most of the U.S. mainland.
These events truly show how spying in general before and during the Cuban Missile Crisis is responsible for the event in the first place. Had planes not discovered the missile batteries and the suspicious Russian warships, the reason for the significant change in relations between the two countries. The Cold War was, at this point, very close to becoming a hot one.
The possibility of nuclear warfare became more of a reality after the CIA utilized a more well-known form of spying to learn about what was happening in Cuba. An agency official named Tom Hewitt sent a two-man team of exiled Cuban nationals, Esteban Marquez Novo and Yo-Yo Napoleon, up Cuba's San Diego River via canoe. These two reported that they detected missiles and military bases being set up by the Soviets. There's no denying the harsh truth. The Soviet Union was deploying missiles in Cuba.
This forced President John F. Kennedy to take action. Originally, JFK did not want the Soviet Union and Cuba to know that he had discovered the missiles from the aerial shot by the U-2 planes, so he met secretly with his advisors to discuss the problem. The relationship between the U.S. and the Soviets had become immensely more toxic compared to what it was at the end of World War II.
Now the two countries were at odds because of the heightening tensions during the Cold War. So CIA Director John A. McCone gave 3 options to President JFK after discovering the missiles. Option 1 was to do nothing and live with the situation, which in my opinion is the worst option. Option 2 is to resort to an all-out blockade, which would probably require a declaration of war, and to be effective would mean the interruption of all incoming shipping. Or option 3 was military action, which has a high possibility of a bad outcome.
Eventually, on October 22, 1962, Kennedy revealed these discoveries on television and declared that any missile launched from Cuba by Russia would require full retaliation by the U.S., meaning all-out nuclear war and mutually assured destruction. After many meetings, President JFK decided
to place a naval blockade or a ring of ships around Cuba. He called it a quarantine to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies. It was an attempt to impose a strategy of containment that the U.S. utilized for most of the Cold War. In addition, he demanded the removal of the missiles already there and the destruction of the sites. Below is a headline from the AZ Republic during this situation.
Not only did a naval blockade occur, but Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2, which meant military forces stand ready to deploy and fight in 6 hours or less, for the first time in history, one level short of general war. In addition, planes were moved to bases in the southeast and put on alert.
In November of 1962, U-2 missions continued, and other Air Force planes flew reconnaissance missions as well. Surgical strikes were proposed to Kennedy as a means to take out the missile sites, but the capabilities of the plane's accuracy at the time made it unreasonable.
During this period, a U-2 plane was shot down by Cubans, and the pilot was killed. On the same day, Minuteman missiles, which were capable of intercontinental strikes, were put on alert, which worried Nikita Khrushchev, the current premier of the Soviet Union, enough that he removed the Soviet missiles from Cuba, and the standoff was finally over.
The U.S. conceded in removing all nuclear weapons from Turkey, and once the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, they instead escalated the building of their military arsenal. The missile crisis was over, however, the arms race was not.
Even though the Soviet Union no longer exists, the U.S. still employs a broad variety of espionage in the world. There are still on-the-ground spies. However, new technologies such as predator drones and cyber warfare have become prominent forms of information gathering by the U.S. government. This raises questions about how much privacy each person should be allotted by the government. Should the NSA and other security agencies be allowed to have access to all citizens' personal information and data in the name of national security?